The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 4th chapter. Glory to you, Lord. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The Gospel of the Lord. So one of the important things that they tell you need to learn when you do active listening is to pay very close attention to the questions that people ask you. Because sometimes the questions that you get asked are not exactly the questions you may be expecting. And I think that's really important in today's Gospel reading, to pay really close attention to the question that Jesus asks the disciples. After he wakes up, and he calms the storm, and the waves stop, and all that stuff is calm, he says to the disciples, he asks the disciples, "Why are you afraid?" Why are you afraid? Not the question that I often hear, which is, "What are you afraid of?" It sounds to me sometimes like Jesus is mocking the disciples for being afraid of things that legitimately could kill them. But that's not really the question Jesus asked. He doesn't ask what they're afraid of. He knows darn well what the disciples are afraid of. They are afraid, he knows, of storms on the Sea of Galilee. That was something that they really should be afraid of. The storms on the Sea of Galilee can be really, really intense, and it's not always obvious. If you have been to the Sea of Galilee, or if you've seen some of the pictures that I've brought back, sometimes it's not that big a body of water. It just doesn't seem like it could be that dangerous. And the first time that I was there, it was like that dead calm. It was absolute glass. And we were out in the boat, a much bigger boat than the disciples would have been in, and you couldn't imagine how this could ever be something that anybody would be afraid of. So the second time that I was there, it was, like Snoopy says, it was a dark and stormy night. It was sort of a dark and stormy morning. It wasn't anything like the windstorm that Mark describes, but it was enough that the waves were a little choppy, and it was dark and overcast, and the hotel we were staying at had a big plate glass window so you could look out on the Sea of Galilee. And I saw it, and it was a little choppy, and there was a little bit of white-cappiness going on the lake. And I thought, well, that's probably not a big deal, and because we were supposed to go out of the boat that morning. And I thought it was not really a big deal because I personally have never been in the Navy. Well, one of our guys on the group was a retired Navy guy. He came into breakfast, took one look at the thing, and said, "I ain't going out on a boat in that water." He could see right away that was dangerous, and that was nothing like what the disciples faced. They were professional fishermen. They were professional sailors. They knew this was dangerous. They knew not to take this lightly. Jesus knew what they were afraid of. They were right to be afraid of the storm. They were also afraid, and Jesus knew this, of things that came up suddenly and unexpectedly, and that's the other problem with storms on the Sea of Galilee, is that they come up unexpectedly. And like any normal person, when something comes out of the blue and you're not expecting it and it can kill you, it scares you. It makes you wonder, what the heck is going on? So the geography of that area is that there's a series of valleys that come down from the Mediterranean, and they channel into this valley where the Sea of Galilee is. And so when the winds come down, it is a huge storm. It's not something like we had last night, where we just hear a lot of blowing rain and stuff like that. It really is, actually I discovered this when I was looking at the readings this week. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the word for whirlwind that Crawford read in Job The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, this cyclone. That's the word that Mark uses to describe what this storm was. It actually kind of was a cyclone. It was not something minor. And you couldn't tell when it was going to happen. Will it happen now? Will it stop? Will it start again? You didn't know. Stuff that comes out of the blue, and you couldn't see it coming, and it can kill you? That's scary. I mean, a storm that suddenly happens in a church basement this week, when some nut comes in with a gun and starts shooting people. Where did that come from? Why is this happening? Those are things we're right to be afraid of, and Jesus knew that. That's what the disciples were afraid of. And the disciples, he knew, were afraid of things that were absolutely outside of their control. These guys were professional sailors. They were professional fishermen. They knew the limits of what they could take care of. They knew what happened when they got into a storm. They knew how far the storm could go, and they could deal with it. They were beyond their limits. And it's one thing to say, oh, I'm going to be macho, I'm going to take care of stuff. But when you've reached your limits, when you know you can do no more, and something can kill you, you're right to be afraid of it. Those were what the disciples were afraid of, and Jesus knew it. So he doesn't ask them, what are you afraid of? He knows. Instead, he asks them, why? Why are you afraid? Why are you paralyzed with fear? It sounds like the same question, but it's really not. What he's really asking the disciples is to think about the next time they're in a storm. And he's saying to them, listen, these things are really scary. They can kill you. Why are you approaching them as though God doesn't know? As though God doesn't care? As though God won't help you? You know, whenever you face a scary situation, the thing that really causes fear is when you think you have to face it alone. When you think that nobody will help you. When you think that nobody cares, maybe even God. So what Jesus is really calling him to do when he says, don't you have faith, is not to believe that there won't really be storms, or that the storms can't kill you. The faith that Jesus is calling his disciples to, and the faith that Jesus calls us to when we face storms in our lives, is a kind of faith that has confidence that God knows what's going on in our lives and what the storm is, even when we don't know all the details of the storm. You know, that's one of the things that scares me about storms in my life. I'm not quite sure what's happening. And so I feel like I got to tell everybody, if I want help, I better be able to tell you all the little details and how I'm feeling about it, what's going on, and what I think is happening, but I'm not really sure. Sometimes we think we got to do that with God. Hey God, wake up! You know, listen, let me tell you all the stuff's going on. Part of the confidence of faith in facing a storm is knowing that God actually knows more about what's going on in the storm than I do. I may not know all the details and all the places that are things that are going on, but if I know God knows already, that means I'm not alone yet. That was the first piece that Jesus wanted his disciples to know. That's what he wants us to know. Even when it seems like God's asleep on the cushion, God actually does know what's going on and what storms are happening in our lives, and even the details that we can't explain to know. What Jesus called his disciples to do, what he calls us to do in facing the storms, is to have faith that actually God really does care about what's happening to us, even if it doesn't seem like God is as worked up and wrapped around the axle about it as we would like God to be. Because that's what the disciples want from Jesus, right? Don't you care? That's the question they ask him. Don't you care? Because if you care, you know, we're all sitting here going, oh my God, we're dying. You should be doing the same thing. You should be hopping up, and there should be something dramatic here going on. So in the bullet, on the bulletin cover, and the email that you got this week, with there are pictures of Jesus that are drawn by artists calming the storm. and especially the one in the email, has Jesus doing Leonardo DiCaprio on the Titanic. Ta-da! It's like, the Lord of heaven and earth is not dumb. Does not stand on the bow of the boat. It never says that in the text. In fact, in Mark's Gospel, all it says is just Jesus woke up and said, hey, knock it off. And that was it. And it was over. He didn't have to get all dramatic about it, but sometimes we feel like if people, we want people to be all agitated and excited about stuff that's going on in our lives, or they don't really care, and we project that onto God. And if God's not fixing stuff right now the way we want it, and seeming all bent out of shape, God must not care. And what Jesus is trying to show the disciples is, even if God reacts in a way that doesn't make sense to you, it does not mean God does not love you, or care about you, or the problem and the storm that you're facing. If you know that God's love and God's power are there and cares about you, that gives you the faith and confidence to face a legitimately scary thing. And if you can have that, then maybe the most important part of faith is the kind of faith that allows you to act boldly in the midst of the storm. When you don't kind of know exactly what God's going to do or how God's going to do it, but you trust that God will do something in you, with you, around you, something's going to happen. See, here was the problem with the disciples. When they woke Jesus up, they really, at this point in the story, could not have been expected to say, oh, Jesus, we know that you have command over the wind and the waves. Stand up and say, stop, be quiet, and you can calm the storm. They really didn't know enough to be able to say we could expect that out of Jesus, but they could have at least said, teacher, wake up, help us bail the boat out. Here's a bucket, do something. They don't. They expected nothing. They just sort of said, oh, we're dying, you should care, but we don't really expect you to do anything that's going to make a difference in our lives. What Jesus was calling them to do was to act with courage and boldness in a way that actually expected God to act, in a way that they might not know, but that they could count on would happen. And if you can have that kind of confidence, then you're able to face legitimately scary, dangerous, and even deadly situations in your life, and be able to know that you're not going to have to do it and face it alone. Because in the end, Jesus did not promise his disciples that there would be no more storms. He did not promise them that he would calm all of their storms quickly and easily, as he did on the lake. He did not even promise them that none of those storms would be dangerous or even kill them. What he did promise them was that they would never have to face it alone. That God would always know what was going on. That God always cared about them. And that even if a storm managed to hurt them or kill them, the storm finally was not going to have the last word in their life. That in the end, God's power and God's love was going to bring them through every storm. Even a storm that could hurt them or kill them.